Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today I'd like to share with you a Irish chain pinwheel quilt. Now this is made with 2.5-inch strips. One jelly roll's not quite enough, so I would recommend 2 jelly rolls. That's going to give you a chance to have lots of freedom in cutting. You can add borders, and it can be used for binding. The quilt does not have a border on it, and that will give you a chance to add what you'd like for the border. So I would recommend 2 jelly rolls and then 2 yards of a beautiful background fabric. Jelly rolls are very unique, each to their own, but for this quilt, you're just going to be able to cut your fabric randomly. This is kind of a scrappy quilt. This particular jelly roll, the Jewelscape, will make it look like I have fussy cut all of those colors, but you will see that they have just been random cuts. So this is going to work with any jelly roll, just cut them randomly. The jelly roll that I have chosen is from Quilting Treasures, and the fabric is called their Jewelscapes. They have it in a cool line and a warm line. This fabric is an ombre fabric, which means on one edge of that selvage it starts with one color, but it changes the color as you go along. So the fabrics are different on one side to the other. So we have beautiful greens and blues and purples. You can see how that changes color. So for this project, I did choose the Cool Tone Jelly Roll. This whole quilt is built around 2.5 inches. So we have that 2.5-inch jelly roll, and for the 2 yards of the background fabric, just cut it all into 2.5-inch strips. From there, we're going to cut our components. So for the jelly roll, we're going to need 144 pieces at that 2.5 inches, cut at 10.5 inches. From the rest of the pieces, we're going to need 32 pieces at 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, 32 pieces 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and 32 pieces at 2.5 inches by 1.5 inch. From the background fabric, we do have everything cut at 2.5 inches. We will need 128 pieces cut at 2.5 inches by 5.5 inches. I'm going to need 32 of each of these different sizes, 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Once we have this all cut, we're going to be able to sew them together. From the 144 strips, take 16 strips. Match them up with the 32 4.5-inch pieces. We're going to divide that 32 pile up and sew them on each end. So we have 2.5 by 4.5, 2.5 by 10.5, 2.5 by 4.5, and 16 pieces. So with the rest of those 10.5-inch strips, we're going to sew on the 5.5-inch strips. So we have 2.5 by 5.5, 2.5 by 10.5, 128 and 128. So let's start and sew these 2 piles together. I do have a little bit of a trick on cutting out your background fabric the same as your strips. Sometimes the strips are not exactly 2.5 inches, but we do want this to be the same. So what I like to do is mark a ruler. I'm going to take that strip of fabric, and this is that jelly roll with those pinked edges, and I'm going to lay a ruler right over top. I do want the ruler to go on the outside of those zigzags, and I want to mark my ruler on the outside. This jelly roll's measurement is from the inside of that pinked edge, but I do want to match up my background fabric to their cut size. So my 2.5-inch widths of fabric for the background fabric are this size, not the 2.5 inches. I call it 2.5 inches because it's going to match these 2.5 inch strips. So when I place them together, that measurement is the outside. That way, when we do go to sew those together, we're going to be able to match them. I'm going to sew along this edge. So I'm going to be able to match those edges and stitch that 1/4 inch. And don't worry that this is a little bit more than 2.5 inches. We're going to take care of that later. Let's just get our pieces stitched together. So the 2 piles are done. The one with the 2 ends, we will put that aside. The other pile, we need to divide it up into 4 piles, and each pile needs to have 32 strips. From there, we're going to add on some of the other pieces. Let me just turn it sideways so you can see it. So we have 4 piles, 36 pieces in each pile. On the end of one, where the dark end is, we're going to put on the 3.5 inch. The next one's going to be the 2.5 inch. The next one, 1.5. We're going to repeat that on the opposite side. So where the light side is, we're going to put the 3.5 inch, the 2.5 inch, and the 1.5 inch. We're going to sew those ends on the same way, and I would recommend to keep them in this order as you do sew them together. Once those are stitched and pressed and you put them together, they will equal the same size. And you're going to notice that we have the small, medium, and large on that end, and the small, medium, and large on the other side, and nothing on the 2 ends. You can also see that you have this little bit of an angle going on, so that's exactly what we're looking for. We are now going to be able to sew these together, and we're going to sew them together exactly as they are. But we're going to have to keep in mind that this is not 2.5 inches. Even though they do claim 2.5 inch jelly rolls, this was a little bit more. And in my case, the difference was 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to keep that in mind when I do sew these together. Normally, we stitch with a scant 1/4 inch. And in this case, I want to stitch with a generous 1/4 inch. So I'm going to divide whatever that little space is, which is that 1/8 of an inch, in half and put that into that seam allowance. There is a way that we can find our own personal 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're going to do it very easily. Let's take the fabric, fold it in half. And you will see here that I have put a mark on my halfway mark. From there, I'm going to do a 1 inch mark close to that seam allowance. So from my center over, I have 1 inch. This is now going to be my seam allowance. So when you're looking at the sewing machine, this is my seam allowance. So there's 2 things we can do. We can put a marking along the edge of our bed or move that needle over a little bit. We are now going to be able to sew all of our strips together using our own personal 1/4 inch seam allowance. We can always check our personal seam allowance when we have some pieces sewn together. Our personal 1/4 inch will give us a 2 inch piece, so we're going to be able to measure that piece will be 2 inches. Once those 4 rows are sewn together, we're going to be able to join them up with that pile that we put aside. Take this large pile and divide it in half. And we're going to take that half and put it on the other side. Now we're going to be able to sew those together. The centerpiece is going to join those pieces. And this is going to give us 16 nice big blocks. So be sure to sew these strips together using that personal 1/4 inch seam allowance that we've established for all of these pieces. Once we have those personal seam allowances done and stitched, all of these rows are now 2 inches. From here, we're going to be able to square up this block. You can really see that we have these diagonal seams. We can trim this up to two different measurements. We can trim it up to the 18.5 inches, which will be that outside measurement. And we can also trim it down to an 18 inch. I have a nice big 18-inch ruler, so I'm going to use that and trim all of my blocks to 18 inches. If you have an 18.5-inch ruler, you could definitely use that. Well, now we're going to be able to take these trim blocks and sew them together in fours. So they're big 18-inch blocks. We're going to want those smaller pieces matching up together in the center. So that is giving us a secondary pattern, and it's creating this big pinwheel. None of the seams match, so we don't need to worry about matching seams. As long as those big squares are the same, they are going to sew together. And from here on, we're going to be able to use a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. So when we put it all together, we have that nice big pinwheel shape. Now, because we did get 2 jelly rolls, we're going to be able to make more pieces if you'd like it larger, or you could add on multiple borders or a pieced border, any border you'd like. If not, you do have the extra jelly roll pieces to add some binding on when you have it finished quilted. It's a fun quilt to make, and the pieces were really chosen randomly. This particular fabric had an ombre effect, so it sort of looks like I really did fussy cut them, but I did not. It's a great pattern to do as a scrappy quilt or just any 2 jelly rolls. Just have fun, lay them out, cut them random, and you're going to have a finished quilt. I will put a link in the description to my worksheet, and this is just going to give you the cutting sizes that I used, so you're going to be able to lay that out. But if you're going to make additional pieces, then you'll have to keep that in mind. And this really is as simple as there's the 1 block, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. I do hope this helps you out, and I hope you give it a try. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. I'll put a link in the description for that PDF. And as always, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and I do have a newsletter. It's free under Sew Very Easy. Thanks again for joining me. Bye for now.